Nikon F3 was introduced in 1980. Canon New F1 was introduced in 1981. They are the top professional SLRs before cameras entering autofocus age. Before F3, Nikon dominated professional SLR market with its professional models F and F2. Both F and F2 are pure mechanical cameras, meaning their shutters do not depend on battery. F2 can be seen as an upgrade or improvement of F. Both cameras share some common parts, such as focusing screen. However, F3 is a completely different camera from F2. They don't share common parts. Most importantly, F3 uses an electronic shutter, depending on batteries for operation. Why do we need an electronic shutter for a camera? The only reason to use an electronic shutter is automation. For any camera, if it has an electronic shutter, it must have automation. In manual focus age, automation means auto exposure. If you have an electronic camera, it must have auto exposure. On the other hand, if your camera does not have auto exposure, it must be a mechanical camera. In 1976, Canon introduced an amateur SLR, AE1, which is an electronic camera totally depending on batteries for operation. It was a huge success. That made people thinking, can a professional SLR be an electronic camera? Historically, professionals were more conservative than amateurs. When Nikon introduced the first electronic professional SLR, the F3, in 1980, many professionals were reluctant to shift from F2 to F3. They didn't trust electronics. Nikon's main selling point and reputation were high quality and reliability. In those days, when you ask people why choosing Nikon, most likely the answer is reliable. Nikon could not afford damaging its reputation with its top model. Therefore, for F3, Nikon did the most rigorous design and used the highest grade electronic parts. For example, all electronic contacts are gold-plated in order to avoid oxidation. The production line was also top stringent. Instead of random sampling, every camera was examined through quality control. The outcome, F3 became the most reliable camera of all brands, not just as a new camera, but after decades of abuse. Other brand professional cameras may have advantages in certain aspects over Nikon F3, but in terms of long-term reliability, there is no comparison to F3. F3 was manufactured from 1980 to 2001. It is the professional camera with the longest production time. By 2001, Nikon F4 had long been replaced by F5. Cameras had already entered into digital age. As a comparison, Canon terminated its New F1 production in 1994. Canon New F1 was released 1 year later than Nikon F3. However, New F1 is a more conservative camera. It has a mechanical-electronic blend shutter. Mechanical shutter speed ranges from 125 of a second to 2000 of a second. Electronic shutter speed ranges from 60 of a second to 8 seconds. When the battery is removed, the shutter from 125 of a second to 2000 of a second works properly, but shutter speed becomes 90 of a second when you set between 60 of a second to 8 seconds. When you use manual exposure mode, you can have top shutter speed of 2000 of a second. However, if you use aperture priority mode, the top shutter speed only reaches 1000 of a second. In shutter priority mode, the top shutter speed can also go to 2000 of a second, but in order to use shutter priority mode, you have to attach a motor drive to the camera. Another feature that New F1 lacks is auto exposure lock, or AE lock. New F1 does not have AE lock feature. As a comparison, Nikon F3 has top shutter speed of 2000 of a second in any mode, and it has AE lock feature. AE lock is an important feature for auto exposure only. You don't need AE lock in manual exposure mode. Canon New F1 User Manual, page 29, says that the New F1 is basically a manual exposure camera. As we know, manual exposure does not need an electronic shutter. Manual exposure can be achieved through a mechanical shutter. Canon New F1 is in favor of manual operation rather than automatic operation. Therefore, even though Canon New F1 has a blend of mechanical and electronic shutter, it emphasizes the mechanical shutter. It is more of a mechanical camera than an electronic camera. On the other hand, Nikon F3 is a true electronic camera. F3 only has one mechanical shutter for backup use, which is 60 of a second. That is why I said Canon New F1 is more conservative than Nikon F3. F3 users use automatic exposure more than manual exposure because automatic operation is simple and easy to use with F3. Nikon must be very confident about its electronic shutter. There is a common misunderstanding with Canon New F1. Many people think that aperture priority auto exposure can only be achieved when AE Finder FN is attached. In fact, other viewfinders such as Eye Level Finder FN can also have aperture priority mode. The only problem is, with the other finders, the camera will not display shutter speed in aperture priority mode. AE Finder FN is the best because it can display shutter speed in aperture priority mode. Again, in aperture priority mode, the top shutter speed only reaches 1000 of a second, no matter what viewfinder you use. Another good feature with the AE Finder FN viewfinder is that it has a Judas window that can show aperture number of the lens. This is Canon's only viewfinder that has this feature. No other Canon cameras have this window. As a comparison, most Nikon manual focus SLRs since F2AS, such as F3, FM, FE, FM2, FE2, FA, and FM3A have this Judas window. Nikon calls it ADR, or Aperture Direct Readout window. Nikon F3 viewfinders give 100% of view coverage, whereas Canon New F1's finder only gives 97% of field coverage. Nikon F3 viewfinder is vertical attached. You detach the viewfinder vertically. Canon's viewfinder is horizontally attached. You detach the viewfinder horizontally. I personally prefer Canon's release method. For your reference, Nikon F4 and F5 changed to horizontal release method. Nikon F3 only has a center weight metering mode. Canon New F1 has average, partial, and spot metering modes. However, each metering mode requires a specific focusing screen. If you have a focusing screen that is dedicated to average metering, you cannot have partial metering or spot metering. If you want spot metering, you have to replace the focusing screen with one that is dedicated to spot metering, but cannot have average metering or partial metering. This is not convenient. For this reason, most people would stick to a focusing screen that is dedicated to average metering and not bother with partial metering or spot metering. Nikon F3 has mirror lock feature. Canon New F1 does not have mirror lock. Nikon F3 has a flash hot shoe on the film rewinding knob. Canon New F1 has the hot shoe on top of the viewfinder, which is more convenient. However, F3 has TTL flash capability. New F1 does not have TTL flash capability. This is another aspect that F3 is more advanced than New F1. Note that the hot shoe on F3 is Nikon's proprietary mount, not the ISO standard mount. It accepts old Nikon SB12 flash unit. If you want to use new flash units such as SB28 or SB800, you need to attach an adapter such as AS17 adapter. You can use the most advanced flash unit designed for digital cameras on F3 and have TTL flash capability. In terms of ease of use, most people prefer Nikon F3. Indeed, F3 is very easy to use. Its operation interface is simple and straightforward. Its handling is super smooth. An amateur who is familiar with Nikon non-professional cameras such as FM2 can easily master most of the functions in F3. On the other hand, Canon New F1 is not that easy to use. As far as I know, even some quite advanced photographers don't know when aperture priority mode is available, or when shutter priority mode is available, or when spot metering is available, or what difference is between an eye-level finder FN and an AE finder FN, or what shutter speed you will get when you set the shutter speed to 60 of a second when battery is not available. However, I feel Canon New F1 easier to handhold than F3. Now let's talk about lenses. Nikon F3 can use most F-mount lenses. The earliest pre-AI lenses from 1959 to 1977 can be mounted with stop-down metering capability. All other manual focus lenses perfectly work on F3. Autofocus lenses, except the newest G lenses and P lenses, can also work properly on F3. In manual focus age, Nikon lenses are considered by professionals the best quality lenses and generally slightly more expensive than Canon lenses. Canon New F1 can use early FL lenses with stop-down metering capability. All FD lenses work properly on New F1. However, Autofocus lenses, that is EF lenses, cannot be mounted on New F1. Old FD lenses use breech lock mount that is not as convenient as a bayonet mount. In 1979, Canon introduced new FD lenses that have similar bayonet mount. Is Canon New F1 as reliable as Nikon F3? The metal body of New F1 is slightly thicker than F3. New F1 is heavier than F3. Therefore, New F1 should withstand collision better than F3. A major weak point of F3 is the LCD panel in its viewfinder. It tends to blur after many years of use. New F1 has similar issue. Statistics from long-term use seem to show that New F1 has more electronic issues than F3. In manual focus age, there are professional 35mm SLRs other than F3, notably Canon New F1, Pentax LX, and Olympus OM4 Ti. Different photographers have different preference. Some prefer Canon, some prefer Pentax, and some prefer Olympus. You can point out certain advantages of these cameras over F3. However, over the decades, people vote for the best camera with their own money, and Nikon F3 got over 70% of the vote. In the 1980s, over 70% of professionals chose Nikon F3. From this aspect, F3 is undoubtedly the king of 35mm SLRs.